The sky tore open like a wound the day the Aesir and Vanir gods clashed, spears of lightning splitting the heavens, winds howling with the fury of armies unseen. This wasn't just a battle, it was the unraveling of the world's order, a war that would shake the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Imagine the mightiest storm you've ever witnessed, multiply its violence 1,000-fold, and you might come close to the cataclysm that began when these two godly factions met on the field of fate. The Aesir, rulers of Asgard, warriors of wisdom and war, faced the Vanir, masters of magic and the unseen forces of nature. This was more than a feud, it was a collision of worlds, a struggle that would redefine the cosmos. You've heard of rivalries, sports teams, empires, even siblings squabbling over petty grudges. But the Aesir-Vanir War was something else entirely. Picture the tension of modern superpowers on the brink of conflict, then set it against a backdrop of divine magic and primordial destiny. The stakes weren't just territory or pride, they were the very fabric of existence. The Vanir, with their deep connection to the earth and its mysteries, wielded powers even Odin himself coveted. And the Aesir, with their unshakable might, refused to bow to any force, celestial or otherwise. When these titans clashed, the 9 realms trembled. What drove these gods to war? Was it pride, power, or something deeper, something woven into the tapestry of Norse myth itself? This conflict wasn't just a footnote in legend, it was a turning point, a war that would birth alliances, betrayals, and even shape the gods we think we know today. By the time the dust settled, nothing would be the same. So let's journey back to the beginning, to that first earth-shattering clash, and uncover the secrets of the Aesir-Vanir War, a story of ambition, magic, and the price of divine pride. Strap in, because this isn't just mythology, it's a saga written in lightning and blood. The Aesir and Vanir weren't just rival clans, they were reflections of two fundamental forces shaping the Norse cosmos. On one side stood the Aesir, the Stormbringers, the rulers of Asgard's golden halls. Think of them as the gods of structure, kings and warriors like Odin, the All-Father, with his hunger for wisdom and mastery of fate, or Thor, whose hammer could level mountains and whose rage could shake the heavens. Their power was raw, tangible, tied to conquest and the order of things. They were the gods you called upon before battle, the ones who demanded oaths and thrived on the clash of steel. Now shift your gaze to the Vanir. Where the Aesir were fire and thunder, the Vanir were the whisper of growing crops, the pulse of tides under a full moon. Freyr, lord of harvests and sunlight, could make fields flourish with a gesture. His sister Freyja, draped in falcon feathers and seiðr magic, could peer into the threads of destiny itself. The Vanir didn't conquer, they wove. Their power wasn't in armies but in the unseen, the fertility of the land, the pull of love, the secrets coiled in the roots of Yggdrasil. Here's the fascinating tension: the Aesir built kingdoms, but the Vanir made them thrive. The Aesir's halls were fortified with spears and shields, while the Vanir's groves hummed with enchantments older than time. This wasn't just a difference in skills, it was a clash of worldviews. The Aesir saw strength in dominion, in bending the world to their will. The Vanir understood strength as harmony, as working with the grain of existence rather than against it. But don't mistake the Vanir for gentle mystics. Their magic was fierce, wild, something even Odin sought to master. And the Aesir, their wars weren't just for glory, they were about survival in a cosmos where even gods could fall. Two pantheons, two ways of shaping reality, hurtling toward a conflict that would force them to choose annihilation or alliance. The war wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary. Because in the end, neither side could claim the cosmos alone. The spark that ignited the Aesir-Vanir War wasn't a single act of violence. It was a slow burn of resentment, a series of misunderstandings and betrayals that turned allies into enemies. At the heart of this fracture stood Gullveig, a Vanir seeress whose very presence in Asgard became a battleground. Draped in gold and whispering prophecies, she wasn't just a visitor. She was a living challenge to the Aesir's authority. Some say she came to share Vanir wisdom, to bridge the divide between the Pantheons. Others claimed she wielded seiðr magic like a weapon, bending minds and unraveling order. Whatever her intent, the Aesir saw only corruption in her spells, a threat too dangerous to ignore. So they did what warriors do: they struck first. 3 times they burned Gullveig, 3 times she rose from the ashes, her laughter echoing through Odin's hall like a curse. This wasn't just an execution, it was a desecration of Vanir sacredness, a message carved in fire: your magic has no place here. The Vanir didn't merely demand justice, they demanded equality. They sent envoys to Asgard, not with weapons, but with terms. Share your halls, your power, your secrets. Let the Vanir stand as equals, not outsiders. The Aesir's response: a dismissal sharp as a sword's edge. To them, the Vanir's ways were foreign, unsettling, too close to chaos. Here's where the conflict deepened beyond politics into something primal. The Aesir saw seiðr magic, with its trances and whispers, as unmanly, even dishonorable, a craft for women and wanderers, not warriors. Yet Odin himself, ever hungry for power, had secretly practiced it, straddling the line between reverence and shame. Meanwhile, the Vanir watched the Aesir's endless wars with disdain, seeing not glory but waste, a hunger for conquest that left the land barren. These weren't just rival gods, they were mirror images, each reflecting what the other feared most. The Aesir prized the clarity of steel, the certainty of a blow struck in daylight. The Vanir moved in twilight, their power flowing through roots and runes. When diplomacy shattered, it wasn't just armies that clashed, it was worldviews. The Vanir didn't just want revenge for Gullveig, they wanted to tear down the arrogance of Asgard's golden gates. And the Aesir, they would sooner see the world burn than kneel to sorcerers. This war wasn't fought over land or treasure, it was fought for the soul of the cosmos itself. The flames that engulfed Gullveig weren't just fire, they were the first battle cry of a war foretold. When the Aesir bound her to the pyre, they weren't merely punishing a sorceress, they were testing the limits of Vanir magic itself. 3 times they reduced her to ashes, and 3 times she emerged, reborn from the smoke with eyes like molten gold. Some say she laughed as her flesh blackened, her voice weaving prophecies even as the timbers collapsed around her. To the Aesir, this was proof of her corruption, a witchcraft so potent it defied death. To the Vanir, it was sacrilege, a violation of the sacred balance between their peoples. Gullveig's true role remains shrouded in mystery. Was she a diplomat, arriving in Asgard to share the Vanir's secrets, or a provocateur sent to expose the Aesir's intolerance? Some myths paint her as a sacrificial figure, her burning a deliberate spark to ignite the war both sides knew was coming. Her name itself whispers of greed: Gullveig, gold drink, hinting at the intoxication of power that would consume both pantheons. When the Aesir hurled their spears into her flames, they weren't just attacking a woman, they were striking at the heart of everything the Vanir revered. The Vanir's response was swift and terrible. Where the Aesir wielded axes, they unleashed storms, crops withered in Midgard, rivers ran backward, and the very air grew thick with curses. Their fury wasn't blind rage, it was precision. They understood the Aesir's weakness, their reliance on order, so the Vanir unwove it. Battlefields dissolved into mist, warriors forgot their own names, and Odin's ravens returned to him with empty beaks. This wasn't just retaliation, it was a lesson. The Vanir proved that magic could paralyze armies, that their power wasn't just different, but in many ways, superior. Yet beneath the vengeance lay a deeper wound. The burning of Gullveig wasn't merely an act of war, it was a rejection. By refusing to honor her life, the Aesir rejected the Vanir's right to exist as equals. And in that rejection, the Vanir saw their future, always outsiders, always lesser. So they fought not just for vengeance, but for survival. The war had begun, and neither side could foresee the price they'd pay, or the strange kinship that would eventually rise from the ashes. The first clash between the Aesir and Vanir wasn't a battle, it was a storm of divine fury that redrew the boundaries of the 9 realms. When Odin cast Gungnir across the battlefield, the spear flew with the certainty of fate itself, splitting the sky like a jagged crack of thunder. Its tip never missed, its path never wavered. Every throw carved another scar into the earth, as if the All-Father's will alone could rewrite the shape of the world. Yet for every strike from Asgard's mightiest, the Vanir answered with tricks that defied the very laws of war. They didn't just fight, they unraveled. One moment, a Vanir warrior might stand before an Aesir champion, sword raised. The next, they'd dissolve into a swarm of stinging bees or melt into the morning mist, leaving their enemies slashing at empty air. The battlefield itself became a nightmare of shifting realities. In one breath, the ground beneath the Aesir's feet would harden to unbreakable stone, trapping them like statues. In the next, the earth would soften to sucking quicks, and, swallowing whole ranks of warriors, while Vanir archers, perched on clouds woven from their own spells, rained arrows tipped with poisons no healer could name. Freyja's falcon cloak let her soar above the carnage, her spells twisting the minds of even Odin's berserkers, turning their rage inward until they turned on their own kin. Meanwhile, Freyr's golden boar Gullinbursti charged through Aesir lines, its bristles burning like 1,000 tiny suns, leaving trails of molten earth in its wake. But the true horror wasn't the weapons or the magic, it was the war's hunger. The conflict gnawed at the roots of Yggdrasil, sending tremors through every realm. Midgard's mortals woke to blood-red skies and withered harvests, their prayers to either Pantheon going unanswered as the gods were too consumed by vengeance to listen. Jotunheim's frost giants watched from the edges, sharpening their axes, sensing weakness in both sides. Even the dwarves, hammering tirelessly in their forges, couldn't keep up with the demand for replacements. Shattered shields, splintered spears, armor rent like parchment. This wasn't a war of attrition, it was a duel of philosophies. The Aesir fought with the precision of a smith's hammer, each blow calculated, each formation a masterpiece of strategy. The Vanir fought like the tides eroding, shifting, impossible to pin down, and as the bodies piled higher, god blood soaking into the soil, giving birth to grotesque new creatures that neither side could control, both pantheons began to realize the terrible truth. They were too evenly matched. For every fortress Odin's armies toppled, a Vanir curse would raise it again, twisted and alive. For every Vanir spell that turned the sky to fire, Thor's thunder would rip it asunder. The war had no front lines, no neat divisions between friend and foe. It spilled into dreams, into memories, into the very threads of time. And as the clash wore on, something unexpected began to stir, not in the gods, but in the realms themselves. The land, the sky, the waters all seemed to push back, as if Yggdrasil itself was weary of their feud. The first cracks in their resolve didn't come from defeat, but from the dawning realization that no one, not even the gods, could survive a war without end. Odin stood at the heart of the storm, his cloak billowing like the wings of his ravens, his single eye burning with the cold fire of foresight. This wasn't just warfare, it was a chess game played with the pieces of destiny itself. While the Vanir wove their magic into the fabric of the battlefield, Odin wielded prophecy as a weapon. He'd drunk from Mimir's well, sacrificed his eye for wisdom, and now he moved his forces with the precision of a seer who'd already glimpsed 1,000 possible outcomes. Every Aesir charge, every feigned retreat, was calculated not just for victory today, but for the war 10 battles hence. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, scouted the enemy's movements, whispering secrets into his ear before the Vanir even raised their shields. Yet, for all his foresight, Odin's greatest strength and weakness was his unshakable belief in the Aesir way. His warriors fought like a tempest given form. Thor's hammer shattered entire battalions with a single swing. Tyr's sword carved through enchantments as easily as flesh, and even the young gods like Heimdall fought with a discipline that turned the chaos of war into something almost beautiful. But their reliance on brute force became their blind spot. The Aesir expected battles to unfold like the sagas. They revered heroic duels, clear lines of advance and retreat, honor etched in blood and steel. What they got instead was a war that refused to follow the rules. The Vanir fought like shadows slipping through fingers. Where the Aesir sought decisive clashes, the Vanir dissolved into the landscape. Their archers fired from trees that hadn't been there moments before. Their warriors stepped into pools of water only to emerge miles behind Aesir lines. Freyja's magic turned the very air against her enemy's fog, thickened into choking mist. Sunlight dazzled eyes at the exact moment a spear struck from nowhere. And Freyr, he didn't just command the land, he convinced it to rebel. Vines twisted around Aesir ankles, roots erupted from the ground to impale horses, and once loyal hounds turned on their masters with frothing jaws. Here's the brutal irony. Odin, the god who'd hung himself on Yggdrasil to learn the secrets of runes, found himself outmaneuvered by the very magic he'd sought to master. The Aesir's strength became their shackles. They were lions fighting a river. Every lunge, every roar, met only with shifting currents. The Vanir didn't just avoid battle, they redefined it, turning the Aesir's legendary prowess against them. Every time Thor raised Mjolnir to crush a foe, the earth beneath him turned to swamp. Every time Odin rallied his warriors with a speech that could stir the dead, Freyja's whispers slithered into their ears, unraveling their resolve like frayed rope. Yet even in their frustration, the Aesir adapted. Odin, ever the pragmatist, began to recruit those who understood the Vanir's ways, witches who'd walked both paths, mercenaries from Alfheim who could sense magic like hounds scenting prey. Slowly, painfully, the Aesir learned to fight a war that wasn't just about strength, but about perception. They built forge fires hot enough to burn through illusions, crafted arrows tipped with cold iron to pierce glamours. But the lesson cost them dearly. For every Vanir trick they unraveled, a dozen Aesir lay lifeless, their bodies unmarked by any visible wound, casualties of a war where the battlefield itself was the enemy. This was the turning point, the moment when both sides realized neither could deliver a killing blow. The Aesir had the might to level mountains, but the Vanir could make those mountains vanish. The Vanir could twist reality itself, but the Aesir's endurance was inexhaustible. Two pantheons, two ways of waging war, locked in a dance where every step forward came at the price of a wound that wouldn't heal. And somewhere in the smoke and the screaming, the first whispers of an unthinkable idea began to stir. What if the only way to win was to stop fighting altogether? The Vanir didn't just wield magic, they were magic, their very breath humming with the pulse of the unseen. Seiðr wasn't a tool to them, it was the language of the cosmos, whispered through the veins of Yggdrasil. Picture a warrior not lifting a sword, but instead plucking the threads of fate like harp strings, bending reality with a flick of the wrist. Freyja, cloaked in feathers and fury, could walk through dreams as easily as stepping through a doorway. Freyr's touch made barren fields burst into harvest, his will coaxing life from soil like a conductor summoning music from silence. This wasn't the blunt force of Mjolnir's thunder, it was artistry, a dance with forces the Aesir could scarcely comprehend. Yet to the Aesir, seiðr was more than strange, it was shameful. Their sagas sang of honorable deaths, of blades clashing in open combat, not of spells spun in shadows. Magic to them was the realm of outcasts and women, a craft Odin pursued in secret despite the stigma. When Vanir sorcerers unraveled Aesir battle lines with a glance, turning shields to serpents and spears to splinters, it wasn't just tactics that were undermined, it was their entire worldview. The Aesir's strength lay in muscle and metal, in the sweat of training grounds and the weight of a well-forged axe. But how do you fight an enemy who turns the wind itself into a blade? The cultural rift ran deeper than battle tactics. The Vanir's magic was tied to cycles, the turn of seasons, the ebb of tides, the rise and fall of life itself. Their power flowed with nature, not against it. The Aesir, meanwhile, carved their will into the world like runes into stone, unyielding, permanent. When Thor split a mountain with Mjolnir, the crack remained for ages. When Freyr blessed a field, the wheat grew as if remembering his touch years later. The conflict wasn't just gods against gods, it was order against fluidity, control against surrender. Here's the twist. The Aesir's disdain for magic crumbled under the weight of necessity. After centuries of bloodshed, even Odin had to admit that Vanir sorcery held power his spear could not match. Slowly, grudgingly, the Allfather began to weave seiðr into his own arsenal. He learned to slip between realms like mist, to carve runes that bled prophecies, to whisper spells that could bind even giants. But this adoption came at a cost. The Aesir never embraced magic as the Vanir did. To them, it remained a weapon, another tool in the belt of conquest. Where the Vanir sang to the earth, the Aesir demanded answers from it. The war's aftermath left an indelible mark on both pantheons. The Vanir, though victorious in proving their power's worth, found themselves forever altered by Aesir influence. Freyja, once a figure of untamed mysticism, became a goddess of both love and war, her magic now tempered with steel. The Aesir, meanwhile, never shook their unease with sorcery, even as they used it. Odin's pursuit of runes and spells was always tinged with desperation, as if he feared the very power he sought. The two pantheons emerged from the war not as conquerors, but as reluctant mirrors, each holding a piece of the other's soul, yet never quite understanding what they'd gain. Magic became the bridge neither side had wanted but both needed. The Vanir's seiðr and the Aesir's might, once opposing forces, now wove together in uneasy alliance. The war had proven one unshakable truth. In a cosmos as vast and wild as the Norse world, no single path, no matter how righteous or ancient, could hold all the answers. Sometimes, survival meant learning to dance in the shadows you once feared. The years bled into decades, then centuries, as the war between the Aesir and Vanir stretched like a scar across time itself. Gods don't die easy. When a blade found its mark, The fallen would wake again in their halls, bones knit whole, only to march back into the grinding maw of battle. But immortality became its own kind of curse. Picture an endless wheel, the same strategies, the same skirmishes, the same faces screaming across the battlefield season after season. Even the thrill of vengeance dulled when every death was temporary, every victory undone by the next dawn. The Aesir's golden halls, once ringing with songs of glory, now echoed with the hollow clatter of armor being donned for the 10,000th time. For the Vanir, the toll was subtler but no less corrosive. Their magic, once a sacred communion with the world, twisted into something desperate spells woven not from harmony, but from spite. Freyja's falcon cloak grew heavy with the weight of countless battles, her visions now clouded by smoke and screams. Freyr, who once made orchards bloom with a smile, found his hands shaking as he called upon powers that now felt less like gifts and more like curses. The land itself began to resist them. Crops sown by Vanir hands withered overnight, as if the earth no longer recognized its own children. The psychological erosion ran deeper than fatigue. Gods are made of stories, and their war had become a stagnant tale. No heroes rising, no grand turns, just the monotonous drumbeat of conflict. Odin's ravens brought fewer prophecies and more grim tallies of losses. Thor's hammer strikes grew slower, his legendary rage dimmed to embers. Even the Vanir's most cunning illusions started to fray at the edges, their magic reflecting not ingenuity but exhaustion. Worst of all was the creeping realization. Neither side could remember what they were fighting for. The burning of Gullveig, that grievance felt distant now, buried under layers of fresh betrayals. Honor, pride, those words rang hollow when shouted over yet another field of fallen allies who'd be back by supper. The war had become a habit, a reflex two pantheons trapped in a dance neither knew how to end. And so the battles grew quieter. Less thunder, fewer dazzling spells, just weary gods going through the motions. The Aesir stopped writing songs about their exploits. The Vanir ceased carving their victories into the sacred trees. Somewhere in the silence between clashes, a question began to form, unspoken at first, then louder with each passing season. What if we're wrong? Not wrong about tactics or alliances, but about the very nature of the conflict. What if the war wasn't meant to be won, but to be broken? The turning point came not with a final, cataclysmic battle, but with something far more fragile, a moment of hesitation. An Aesir spear hovered over a Vanir warrior's heart, then lowered. A Vanir curse died on Freyja's lips as she met Odin's eye across the bloodied grass. No treaties, no grand speeches, just the quiet, shameful acknowledgement that even gods could tire. The fighting didn't stop that day, but its soul had left. What remained was mere momentum, and momentum, eventually, always runs out. The war had no victors, only survivors. Years of bloodshed left both pantheons hollow-eyed, their once gleaming armor dulled by the weight of endless conflict. But the true catalyst for peace didn't come from the gods themselves. It came from the whispers of Jotunheim. The frost giants, long held at bay by the unity of Asgard and Vanaheim, now stirred at the edges of the realms, their hunger sharpened by the gods' division. Their scouts slithered through the battlefield's aftermath, counting the dead, measuring weakness. The Aesir and Vanir had been so busy fighting each other, they'd forgotten the older, colder enemy waiting in the shadows. It was Heimdall, ever watchful, who first sounded the alarm. His golden horn caught the distant rumble of giant armies mustering, their war machines carved from glaciers and bone. Odin, pacing the length of Valhalla with his ravens circling, finally paused. The Allfather knew the math of war. Even if the Aesir and Vanir tore each other apart, the remnants would be too shattered to withstand the giants' advance. Meanwhile, in Vanaheim, Freyja stood before her people, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. "We are bleeding for a feud older than memory," she admitted. But the frost cares nothing for our grievances. The first overture came not with fanfare, but with silence. A single Vanir envoy, draped in a cloak of birch bark and mist, walked unarmed into Asgard's gates. Njord, the sea god who'd long straddled both worlds, stepped forward as mediator. He was neither fully Aesir nor Vanir, a living bridge between the two. His words carried the salt of the ocean, timeless and relentless. "Pride drowns faster than men in a storm. Lay down your spears, or the giants will lay you down forever." Negotiations were less a conversation and more a wary dance. Odin, ever the strategist, demanded hostages, not as prisoners, but as pledges. The Vanir sent Freyr's twin children, radiant with youth, to live among the Aesir. In return, the Vanir welcomed Mimir, Odin's own advisor, a figure so steeped in wisdom even the Vanir's seers bowed to his insights. These exchanges weren't just political, they were symbolic, a mingling of blood and knowledge that forced each side to see the other as kin, not foes. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Thor, of all gods, who'd once reveled in the war's fury, now stood before the assembled Pantheons, his hammer resting unused at his belt. "I've slain enough Vanir to last 10 lifetimes," he growled, "and still they rise. So either we fight until the giants pick our bones, or we swallow our bile and stand together." His bluntness cut through the posturing like a blade through fog. The treaty they forged wasn't built on trust, it was built on necessity. The Aesir would honor the Vanir's magic, granting Freyja a place among their high seats. The Vanir, in turn, would share their secrets of fertility, ensuring Midgard's fields flourished again. Most crucially, both pantheons would face the giants as one, their banners tangled but unbroken. The war ended not with a feast or a song, but with a quiet sigh, the sound of gods who'd finally learned that survival, not supremacy, was the only victory worth claiming. The hostage exchange between the Aesir and Vanir was meant to be a binding thread, a weaving together of two pantheons through shared flesh and blood. Honir, the tall and solemn Aesir, stood beside Mimir, the Vanir's wellspring of wisdom, as they prepared to cross into foreign lands. On the surface, it seemed a fair trade. Honir's presence in Vanaheim would symbolize the Aesir's commitment to peace, while Mimir's counsel in Asgard would bridge the gap between their worldviews. But the gods, for all their power, had underestimated the weight of expectation. Honir was no fool, but his mind moved like a river in winter, slow, deliberate, prone to freezing when pressed. In Asgard, this had been no great flaw. Surrounded by decisive warriors, his quiet contemplation was seen as patience. But in Vanaheim, where every breeze carried meaning and every silence demanded interpretation, his hesitation became a curse. The Vanir would gather beneath the sacred groves, seeking his judgment on disputes or prophecies, only to find him staring into the distance, waiting for inspiration that never came. "Let me think on it," he'd murmur, and days would pass like shadows stretching at dusk. To a people who valued the quick, intuitive dance of magic, Honir's stillness felt like mockery. Mimir, meanwhile, thrived in Asgard like a seed finding fertile soil. His wisdom, earned from drinking deep of the well that bore his name, made him a treasure even Odin coveted. Where Honir faltered, Mimir spoke with the certainty of a man who'd seen the tapestry of fate unravel and reweave itself 1,000 times. His advice turned the tide of battles not yet fought. His rune-carved whispers saved harvests from blight, and soon the Aesir began to rely on him as they once had on Odin himself. But this, too, became a poison. The Vanir, watching from afar, grew restless. Why should their greatest seer lift the Aesir to new heights while Honir, their so-called peace offering, stood silent as a stump? The breaking point came when the Vanir, fed up with Honir's inertia, took matters into their own hands. They beheaded Mimir in a gruesome act of retaliation, sending his severed head back to Odin as a message. No more half measures, no more hollow exchanges. The Allfather, stricken but ever pragmatic, preserved Mimir's head with herbs and incantations, forcing it to speak even in death. The betrayal should have reignited the war, but by then both sides were too weary, too scarred, to return to the blade. Instead, the hostage exchange became a grim lesson piece. They learned couldn't be bought with borrowed minds. It had to grow from the soil of mutual respect, or not at all. Honir's indecision and Mimir's severed head became symbols of the fragile truce, a warning etched in blood. Even the noblest attempts at unity could unravel when the threads were pulled too tight. The Aesir had wanted a diplomat, the Vanir had wanted a seer. In the end, they got neither, only the hollow echo of good intentions drowned out by the old, familiar drum of distrust. The Vanir's patience snapped like a dried branch. Honir's silence, once mistaken for wisdom, had curdled into insult. Every unanswered question, every deferred decision, piled higher until the weight became unbearable. They'd been promised an equal, a god who could stand beside their own seers, but what they got was a hollow figurehead who turned every counsel into a waiting game. Let Mimir speak, they demanded, their voices sharp with suspicion. But Mimir was oceans away in Asgard, his brilliance lighting Odin's halls while Vanaheim languished in uncertainty. The truth struck like a blade. They'd been cheated. The Aesir had kept their wisdom and pawned off a mute, so they took vengeance in the oldest way they knew. Mimir's head left his shoulders with a single stroke, his lips still parted mid-prophecy. When the Vanir messengers arrived in Asgard, they carried no scrolls, no terms, just the ghastly trophy wrapped in cloth, still damp with blood. The message was clear: you gambled with our trust, now see the cost. Odin, staring into the lifeless eyes of his most cherished advisor, didn't rage or vow retaliation. The Allfather understood the brutal arithmetic of power. A severed head was a wound, but the wisdom it held, that was a resource too precious to waste. With hands steadier than his heart, Odin began the grisly work of preservation. Herbs from Freyja's own gardens, bitter, pungent, were packed into the neck's ragged stump. Runes humming with latent power were carved into the flesh of Mimir's forehead, each symbol a stitch in the fabric between life and death. And then, the final blasphemy. Odin whispered to the corpse, not a prayer, but a command. Speak, and against all nature, the head obeyed. The lips moved, the throat rasped. The voice that emerged was both Mimir's and something else deeper, older, as if the well of knowledge he'd drunk from now echoed through him. From that day forward, Mimir's head became Odin's darkest treasure. He hung it from Yggdrasil's branches, where roots drank from the well of wisdom below, and there it whispered secrets no living throat could utter. When the Allfather sought visions of Ragnarök, it was Mimir's severed lips that shaped the prophecies. When the giants marched, it was Mimir's hollowed eyes that saw their paths. The Vanir had meant the beheading as a curse, but Odin, ever the opportunist, turned it into an oracle. Yet the cost of this grim symbiosis haunted both sides. The Vanir, for all their fury, had gifted Odin a weapon far beyond what he'd possessed before, a sage who could never lie, never age, never refuse, and Odin. He carried the weight of what he'd done in the set of his shoulders, in the way he sometimes hesitated before approaching Yggdrasil. To drink from wisdom's well was one thing, to force it to speak through a corpse was another. The lesson lingered like the stench of preserved flesh. Some alliances aren't broken by war, but by the quiet, irreparable cracks of betrayal. The moment Mimir's severed head spoke its first prophecy, the fragile piece shattered like glass under a hammer. Odin's hands, still stained with the herbs of preservation, now curled into fists. This wasn't just a murder, it was a desecration of the truce itself, a slap to the face of Asgard's dignity. The Vanir had crossed a line, and the Aesir's response would be measured not in words, but in blood. Thor needed no prompting. Mjolnir was in the air before the echoes of Odin's rage had faded, its arc splitting the sky like a promise of retribution. But this time, the rules of war were ashes in the wind. The Aesir, masters of honorable combat, now turned to weapons they'd once scorned. Odin carved runes of unraveling into his spear. Spells that didn't just kill, but unmade Vanir warriors found their armor dissolving into rust, their swords crumbling like dried clay. Heimdall, ever the watcher, blew his horn not to warn of attack, but to shatter the veil between realms, letting loose horrors even the Vanir's seers couldn't anticipate. Shadows with too many teeth slithered from cracks in the earth, their hunger honed by centuries of neglect. The Vanir retaliated with a cruelty that bordered on artistry. Freyja, her tears dry now, sang a dirge that turned the very air to poison Ys, your lungs filled with liquid gold, their last breaths gilded and choking. Freyr, who once made orchards bloom, now whispered to the roots of Yggdrasil, urging them to twist around Asgard's foundations like serpents, squeezing prey. Their magic, once a gift to the land, became a weapon against it. Rivers ran backward to drown villages, storms raged in cloudless skies, and the sun itself hesitated at the horizon, as if afraid to witness what came next. This was no longer a war of attrition, it was annihilation. The Aesir unleashed the Einherjar, their immortal revenants, who fought with the frenzied joy of those who knew death was temporary. The Vanir, in turn, raised the Draugr, corpses bloated with curses that burst like plague filled fruit when struck. Battlefields became grotesque gardens of the undead, where severed limbs twitched with unnatural life and the screams of the dying were drowned out by the laughter of things that should never have been summoned. And then came the weapons. Thor's hammer was just the beginning. The Aesir pried open vaults sealed since the dawn of time, unleashing blades that thirsted for god blood and shields that echoed with the screams of forgotten battles. The Vanir, desperate, unearthed relics of their own a horn that could summon the world serpent's kin, a mirror that reflected attacks tenfold, a cloak woven from the silence of the void. The worst was yet to come. Odin, his eye blazing with a light that hadn't been there before, began whispering a name no one had dared speak in centuries, Gungnir's oath. The spear, once a symbol of justice, now thrummed with a barely contained hunger. When he cast it this time, it didn't just fly, it hunted, twisting through space to pierce the hearts of a dozen Vanir at once, their souls unraveling like thread from a spindle. Freyja answered with Brisingamen's lament, her famed necklace shattering into 1,000 shards, each one a blade that sought Aesir flesh with the precision of a falcon's strike. The realms themselves began to bleed. Midgard's skies rained fire and frogs. Jotunheim's glaciers cracked open to reveal screaming faces frozen within. Even Asgard's golden spires darkened under a sun that no longer seemed to care. This wasn't battle, it was the cosmos tearing at the seams. two pantheons so consumed by vengeance they'd forgotten the world they were fighting for. And yet, in the midst of the carnage, a terrible truth dawned. No one was winning. For every Aesir legion reduced to ash, a Vanir stronghold collapsed into the abyss. The war had become a self-eating snake, its tail clamped in its jaws, and the only future it promised was oblivion. The gods, for all their power, were running out of things to destroy. Where was Loki when the realms burned? The trickster's absence in the Aesir-Vanir War isn't just odd, it's suspicious. Myths paint him as chaos incarnate, the spark in every divine conflict, yet the sagas fall strangely silent about his role here. But silence isn't emptiness, it's a canvas for speculation. Some scholars argue Loki wasn't absent at all. He was the quiet hand tipping scales, the whisper that turned grievances into blood feuds. Picture this, a shapeshifter slipping between camps, nudging Odin's paranoia with rumors of Vanir betrayal, then floating to Vanaheim to mourn how the Aesir scorn their magic. No direct attacks, no grand betrayals, just a master manipulator letting gods destroy themselves with their own pride. Later texts hint at darker possibilities. The Flateyjarbók, a medieval manuscript, suggests Loki didn't just observe, he orchestrated Gullveig's burning. What if the seeress who ignited the war wasn't acting alone? Her triple death mirrors Loki's own punishment after Baldur's murder, a symmetry too neat to ignore. And consider this, the war's stalemate served Loki perfectly. Aesir and Vanir locked in endless conflict meant no one was watching him, no one noticing the threads he wove toward Ragnarök. While gods bled, Loki could bargain with giants, forge alliances in shadows, his greatest schemes blooming unnoticed in the war's long twilight. Fans of Norse myth have spun wilder theories. What if Loki was Gullveig, the trickster, ever the shapeshifter, adopting a feminine guise to provoke both pantheons? The Vanir's fury at her burning would make brutal sense if their seeress was actually an Aesir in disguise. Or perhaps Loki played both sides as a double agent sworn to Odin yet whispering secrets to Freyja, ensuring neither faction gained enough ground to end the war. His fingerprints are all over the conflict's prolonging. The hostage exchange gone wrong, Mimir's beheading, even the final, fragile peace that left both sides too weakened to resist the coming frost. The truth, Loki's greatest trick might be convincing history he wasn't there at all. Because in a war where gods forgot their purpose, where logic frayed like old rope, who else but the god of mischief could have woven such perfect, invisible chaos? While the Aesir and Vanir tore at each other's throats, the shadows between them grew crowded with opportunist beings who saw divine war not as a catastrophe, but as a marketplace. The dwarves, ever pragmatic, hammered night and day in their glowing forges, turning the conflict into a golden age of arms dealing. Picture their underground halls, anvils ringing like war drums, bellows puffing like exhausted soldiers, and stacks of gleaming weapons piling higher as the gods' demands grew more desperate. Mjolnir itself had been a dwarf's creation, and now they crafted its lesser cousins by the dozen axes that never dulled, helms that deflected magic, arrowheads dipped in poisons even Freyja couldn't antidote. The Vanir paid in gold mined from dead stars, the Aesir traded favors and future promises, their credit good as long as the battles kept coming. The light elves of Elfheim played a subtler game. Where dwarves sold steel, elves sold silent spies, flitting between realms like dappled sunlight, their loyalty as fluid as their shifting allegiances. An Aesir war council might dismiss their scouts, only to find an elf's dagger pinning a Vanir battle plan to Odin's throne by morning. The Vanir, for their part, prized elven glamour's illusions woven so finely they could make a battalion vanish into the curve of a rainbow. But elves never gave gifts without strings. Every service rendered was a debt incurred, and their ledgers stretched longer than the roots of Yggdrasil. Then there were the giants, not just Jotunheim's frost titans, but the fire giants of Muspelheim, the mountain-skinned hill giants, even the sea giants who lurked in the deepest trenches. They watched the gods' war with slit-eyed patience, selling mercenaries to both sides like a farmer selling livestock. A frost giant's strength could turn the tide of a siege, but their price was steep: land, titles, sometimes the very castles they'd helped capture. The fire giants, meanwhile, trafficked in more destructive currency. They'd rent out their magma worms to melt Asgard's gates, then turn around and sell Vanir commanders enchanted ice to quench the flames. War to them was a furnace, and they were happy to stoke it as long as the bellows kept pumping. Most cunning of all were the Svartalfar, the dark elves who dwelled in the labyrinthine caves beneath Midgard. While others profited from chaos, they specialized in control, ensuring the war burned hot enough to demand their services, but never so hot it consumed their clients. A Vanir general might wake to find his water supply mysteriously poisoned, only for a dark elf envoy to arrive hours later with a cask of antidote for a price. The Aesir, marching toward certain victory, might find their supply routes tangled by bandits who left behind dark elf calling cards carved into the trees. It was extortion masquerading as commerce, and it made the shadows richer than the sunlit realms. Even Yggdrasil's lesser creatures found ways to thrive. Trolls hired themselves out as living siege towers, their hides thick enough to shrug off all but Thor's mightiest strikes. Valkyries, traditionally Chinese letter observers of mortal battlefields, began charging exorbitant fees to ferry godly slain back to their holes, a scandal that nearly broke Valhalla's economy. And the Norns, those weavers of fate, whispered prophecies to both sides for the cost of a single, unbreakable oath each. The war had become an ecosystem, every participant feeding on the other's desperation. But the true power players were those who stayed officially uninvolved. The dragon Nidhogg, gnawing at Yggdrasil's roots, found the war's chaos made his work easier. Every fallen god's scream loosened another thread of the world's fabric. The goddess Hel, ruler of the dishonored dead, watched her halls swell with casualties from both pantheons, her grin growing sharper with each fresh arrival. Even the great wolf Fenrir, chained and seething, tested his bonds more fiercely as the gods weakened one another. They didn't need to pick a side. The war itself was doing their work for them. By the conflict's end, the neutral parties hadn't just profited, they'd reshaped the balance of power. Dwarves now held enough Aesir debt to buy entire wings of Asgard. Elves had treaties etched in blood that would bind both pantheons for centuries. And the giants, they'd stockpiled enough divine favors to make Ragnarok not just a prophecy, but a negotiation. The war's legacy wasn't just in the gods who died or the alliances forged, it was in the quiet, grinning entities who'd turned their desperation into a down payment on the next apocalypse. The war's fury didn't just scar the gods, it cracked the foundations of Yggdrasil itself. The great world tree, whose roots held the 9 realms in balance, groaned under the strain as divine blood seeped into its bark. Rivers across Midgard ran crimson, not from seasonal floods, but from the spilled ichor of fallen warriors trickling down through the branches of the cosmos. Mortals woke to skies split by unnatural hues, auroras blazing at midday, stars rearranging themselves into omens no seer could decipher. The natural order wasn't just disrupted, it was rewritten by the whims of warring gods. Human villages bore the brunt of this celestial reckoning. A farmer plowing his field might suddenly watch his crops wither to ash as a stray Vanir curse drifted down from the heavens. Fishermen hauling nets found their catches mutated fish with too many eyes, their scales etched with runes of ill omen. Worst were the nights when the very air vibrated with distant thunder, not from storms, but from Thor's hammer colliding with Freyr's enchanted shields. Mortals whispered prayers to both pantheons, but their pleas went unanswered. The gods were too busy rending the sky to notice the ants scurrying below. And then came the void spill, where Yggdrasil's roots frayed, gaps opened wounds in reality, where things that should never exist slithered through. Midgard's forests grew blackened patches where trees twisted into screaming faces. A well in a remote village might bubble with water so clear it showed not reflections, but glimpses of hell's bone-strewn halls. Some mortals, driven mad by these visions, walked into the sea or carved strange symbols into their flesh, convinced they'd been chosen as heralds of the unraveling. The realms, once distinct as separate threads, now tangled into a nightmare tapestry. Jotunheim's glaciers calved into Asgard's rivers, chilling the air until even Valkyries shivered in their armor. Elfheim's eternal twilight seeped into Vanaheim's meadows, turning sunlit fields into half-real mirages where flowers bloomed upside down. Even the dwarves, safe in their subterranean forges, felt the tremors their masterworks sometimes fracturing mid-forge, as if the very concept of unbreakable had lost its meaning. Yet the most chilling consequence was the silence of the Norns, the weavers of fate, who once hummed as they spun destiny's threads, now worked with grim urgency, their golden loom fraying at the edges. Some said they'd begun cutting cords prematurely, severing lives that once had centuries left to unfold. Whether this was mercy, sparing mortals from the coming chaos, or desperation, none could say. But when even the architects of time itself falter, the universe holds its breath, and in the deepest roots of Yggdrasil, where Nidhogg's gnawing teeth had scraped bare the tree's pith, something pulsed. A rhythm out of sync with the war's chaos, slow and inevitable as a glacier's creep. The gods, in their fury, had forgotten one unshakable truth: the tree could heal or it could break. And if it broke, their war would be the least of the 9 realms' worries. The last great battle unfolded not with the thunder of glory, but the hollow rasp of exhaustion. By the time the Aesir and Vanir met on that final field, the grass beneath their feet had grown brittle and gray, as if the earth itself had sickened from their feud. Odin's spear arm trembled not from fear, but from centuries of lifting Gungnir against the same faces, the same curses, the same unending cycle of death and resurrection. Across the smoldering plain, Freyja's golden cloak hung dull with ash, her voice hoarse from singing spells that no longer stirred the wind like they once had. Even Thor's legendary swings had slowed, Mjolnir's arc dragging as though the very air had grown thick with regret. The poetic Edda whispers of this moment in stanzas heavy with weariness. The gods clashed, but their blades sang no victory. Their shouts held no fury, only the ache of old men remembering why they began to fight. The battlefield was a graveyard of broken relics, shattered shields inscribed with forgotten oaths, spears planted like tombstones where warriors had simply sat down and refused to rise again. Ravens circled but did not descend. There was no honor left to feast upon. What made this battle different wasn't the scale of destruction, it was the silence. No war cries, no chants, just the labored breathing of immortals who'd run out of hatred to fuel them. When Freyr and Tyr locked swords, their blades met with a dull clang, then stilled. Neither pressed the advantage. They stood there, panting, staring into each other's eyes not as enemies, but as mirrors. The Vanir's once radiant magic now sputtered like dying embers. The Aesir's famed discipline had unraveled into hollow ritual. Then came the rain, not a cleansing storm, but a slow, greasy drizzle that pooled in the cracks of abandoned helms, turning the blood-stained earth to sludge. It was Njord, the sea god who'd loved both sides too much, weeping from the clouds. His tears dissolved the last remnants of battle lust, leaving only a drenched, shivering truth. This war had no victors, only survivors. The poetic Edda marks this moment with a line as simple as it is devastating. Then the gods laid down their weapons, not because they'd won, but because they'd forgotten how to hold them. The truce that followed wasn't celebrated with feasts or songs. It was a quiet agreement, whispered over the bodies of friends who died too many times to count. The Aesir and Vanir left the field not as conquerors, but as refugees carrying the same scars, nursing the same regrets, and walking the same road home at last. The treaty that ended the Aesir-Vanir War wasn't carved on stone or etched in gold. It was written in shared blood and hard-won exhaustion. After lifetimes of warfare, both pantheons faced an uncomfortable truth. Neither could claim victory, but both stood to lose everything if the fighting continued. So they forged a peace not from trust, but necessity, stitching the realms together with terms that would reshape Norse mythology forever. At its core, the agreement demanded one radical shift. The Vanir would stand as equals in Asgard's halls. No longer outsiders, they were granted seats among the Aesir's High Council, their voices weighing as heavily as Odin's own. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was an upheaval of the cosmic order. Freyr, once a Vanir prince, now presided over Alfheim's sunlit fields from Asgard's towers. His sister Freyja took her place among the Valkyries, her falcon cloak draped over the same throne that had once scorned her magic. Even Njord, the sea-weathered god who'd long bridged both worlds, became a keeper of Asgard's sacred harbors, his tides lapping at the Golden Realm's foundations. But peace required more than shared titles. It demanded hostages, not prisoners, but pledges. The Vanir sent their brightest to Asgard, Freyr and Freyja, their golden twins, whose presence ensured their people's loyalty. In return, the Aesir offered Mimir not just a hostage, but a gift of wisdom, his severed head whispering secrets from Yggdrasil's roots. This exchange wasn't about dominance, it was about entanglement. By weaving their fates together, the gods made betrayal unthinkable. To strike one's own kin was to invite the collapse of both pantheons. The most transformative term, however, lay in Freyja's role as teacher. The Aesir, who'd once burned Cirrus's for practicing seiðr, now bowed their heads to learn it from the Vanir's greatest mistress of magic. Picture the scene: Odin, the All-Father, sitting cross-legged like an apprentice as Freyja traced runes in the air, her fingers pulling threads of destiny visible only to those trained to see. Thor, ever the skeptic, grudgingly allowed charms to be woven into Mjolnir's leather grip. Even Heimdall, whose sight pierced illusions, learned to bend light itself from Vanir spell weavers. Shared rituals became the glue of this fragile alliance. Where once the Aesir celebrated with feasts of mead and boasting, they now incorporated Vanir traditions, solstice rites where warriors planted barley instead of burning villages, harvest festivals where spears were exchanged for sickles. The blot, that sacred sacrifice, evolved too, no longer just livestock offered to Odin, but honey cakes shaped like Yggdrasil's leaves, left in sacred groves to honor Njord's tides, and Freyr's fertile soils. Yet the treaty's true genius lay in its imperfections. It didn't erase grievances or force friendship. It simply made coexistence inevitable. The Vanir's magic flowed into Asgard's veins, and the Aesir's discipline tempered Vanaheim's wildness. Two pantheons, once locked in eternal war, found themselves growing strangely alike. Odin's ravens learned to speak in Vanir poetry. Freyja's charms carried the crisp precision of Aesir strategy. The terms weren't just peace, they were evolution proof that even gods could change when the world demanded it. When the war's embers cooled, the gods faced a dilemma deeper than treaties or truces: how to weave trust from the frayed threads of centuries of bloodshed. Their solution was as poetic as it was profound: a cauldron placed at the crossroads of their realms into which every Aesir and Vanir spat, not in disgust but in surrender, each mouthful of saliva mingling until the vessel brimmed with the essence of both pantheons. From this unlikely brew rose Kvasir, a being so suffused with wisdom that his very breath could unravel riddles, and his touch heal wounds no herb could mend. This wasn't just reconciliation, it was alchemy. The gods had turned their shared bitterness into something sacred. Kvasir's birth was more than myth, it was a masterclass in Norse values. Where other cultures might celebrate victory monuments or subjugation oaths, the Norse chose wisdom as their truest trophy. Picture the scene: Odin, his single eye gleaming with unspoken remorse, leaning over the cauldron alongside Freyja, her golden tears salting the mix. Thor, usually so quick to swing his hammer, hesitated before adding his own spit, a silent admission that even thunder must sometimes yield to quiet insight. The act itself was visceral, almost uncomfortably intimate. Spittle, after all, carries the weight of breath, of voice, of the soul's imprint. By blending theirs, the gods acknowledged a truth that had eluded them in battle. Their strength lay not in dominance, but in synthesis. Kvasir's later fate, murdered by dwarves who fermented his blood into the mead of poetry, adds a bittersweet layer to this symbolism. Even in death, his wisdom became a drink that intoxicated gods and mortals alike, flowing through skaldic verses and kingly judgments. The mead's theft by Odin in another famous myth isn't a contradiction but a continuation. Wisdom, once discovered, must be fought for, stolen back from chaos again and again. The cauldron ritual was never about permanent harmony. It was about choosing, moment by moment, to turn strife into something fermentable, something that could intoxicate the world with understanding rather than bloodlust. This myth echoes throughout Norse culture like a refrain. Their legal assemblies, the things, demanded consensus through debate, not force. Their sagas prized cleverness over brute strength. Think of Odin winning the mead of poetry through guile, or Thor outwitted by giants in wrestling matches of wit. Even their view of Ragnarök, the apocalyptic battle to come, carries this tension. The gods know they'll fall, yet they prepare, debate, and strategize until the last moment. The cauldron ritual wasn't an anomaly, it was the Norse ethos distilled. When given a choice between eternal war or spitting into the void together, they chose the latter, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to forge a future worth singing about. The lesson lingers like the aftertaste of that legendary mead. Wisdom isn't the absence of conflict, but what we create from its wreckage. The Aesir and Vanir could have built a monument from the swords of their fallen. Instead, they built a sage from their surrender, and in doing so, they reminded us that even gods must sometimes stoop, not to conquer, but to spit, to blend, and finally, to rise. The Aesir's golden halls had never known such change. With the Vanir's arrival, Asgard's very pulse shifted. where once only the clang of swords and boasts of warriors filled the air, now the scent of blooming barley and the murmur of spells wove through the rafters. Freyja didn't just bring her magic, she brought an entire cosmology. Her seiðr rituals, once dismissed as women's tricks, now took place in Odin's own hall, the Allfather himself watching as her fingers plucked destinies, threads like harp strings. The Valkyries, traditionally choosers of the slain, began incorporating Vanir fertility rites into their ceremonies, spears planted in soil, to ensure fallen warriors' souls would nourish future harvests. Even Valhalla's feast tables groaned under new offerings. Honeyed apples from Idun's orchards now shared platter space with Freyr's golden sheaves of grain. Freyr's ascent in Asgard reshaped Norse worship itself. Where Thor embodied the thunderstorm's fury, Freyr became the gentle rain that made fields flourish. His boar Gullinbursti, once a war beast, now led processions where armored Aesir cast seeds instead of spears. Myths tell of him weeping tears that turned to amber, fitting for a god whose sorrows birthed beauty. Future sagas would cast him as the divine mediator, the one who calmed Thor's rages with a word and persuaded Odin to spare lands his ravens marked for conquest. His annual sacrifice, the Yule boar, became Asgard's most beloved rite, merging Vanir fertility magic with Aesir martial pride. Warriors would swear oaths upon its bristles, their voices trembling not with battle lust, but with the weight of promises meant to last beyond a single season's war. Odin's transformation ran deepest. The god who once burned Cirrus's now wore Freyja's falcon feathers in his hat, a silent homage to the magic he'd once feared. His ravens still brought him news of battles, but now they also whispered of ripening crops and portents in the flight of cranes. When he hung himself anew on Yggdrasil, not for runes this time, but to understand the Vanir's vision spells, his screams shook the tree's roots. Yet he endured, returning with eyes that could see not just doom, but the delicate balance between decay and rebirth. His adoption of seiðr didn't diminish him, it completed him. The war god became the wise god, his spear now as likely to carve protective runes into soil as to pierce an enemy's shield. This cultural alchemy birthed a new kind of hero in the saga's figures like Sigurd, who wielded swords and sewing hooks with equal skill. Mortal kings began appointing both warlords and land spirits priests as advisors, mirroring Asgard's dual councils. The very concept of victory expanded, a battle won meant little if the following winter saw starvation. Even Ragnarok's prophecies shifted where, once they foretold only destruction, now they hinted at renewal, a green shoot rising from Yggdrasil's ashes. The war hadn't just ended, it had fertilized the future, proving that even gods must bend or break. The echoes of the Aesir-Vanir War didn't just linger in myth, they shaped the very fabric of Viking life. Picture a chieftain negotiating peace after a bloody feud, his hands resting on a ceremonial spear, while hostages, often sons of noble families, exchanged homes as living pledges. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was myth made flesh, a direct echo of the divine exchange that ended the gods' war. Historical sagas like the Heimskringla detail these rituals with eerie familiarity, the careful selection of hostages, the oaths sworn over sacred rings, even the shared feast where former enemies drank from the same horn. The Vikings didn't just remember the gods' truce, they reenacted it, believing such acts tied their world to the divine order. But the war's deepest imprint lay in the fusion of worship. Before the conflict, Bronze Age Scandinavians had venerated fertility deities akin to the Vanir, figures tied to soil and seasons. The Aesir's warrior cult arrived later, likely with migrating tribes. Archaeological finds show this shift. Early amulets depicting plows and sheaves gradually give way to swords and spears in the burial mounds. Yet after the Viking Age began, something remarkable appears: Thor's hammer pendants buried alongside barley seeds, Freyr's boar insignias carved onto shield grips. The gods had merged in myth, and so too did their followers' devotion. A warrior might wear Mjolnir for strength in battle, but place an offering to Njord before a sea voyage, his faith as layered as the god's own alliance. Evidence of this blending whispers from runestones and sagas. At the Trelleborg fortress, post holes reveal temples where Odin's spear and Freyr's harvest symbols once stood side by side. The Landnámabók describes Icelandic settlers consecrating their new lands with both blood sacrifices to Tyr and blessing rituals straight from Vanir tradition. Even the seasonal festivals transformed. The Midwinter Jol feast, once a raucous celebration of Odin's wild hunt, now incorporated Freyr's boar sacrifice, its flesh shared to ensure next year's crops. The war's legacy wasn't just coexistence, it was synthesis, a recognition that survival demanded both the sword and the sowing sickle. Perhaps the most striking parallel lies in the Thing assemblies, where disputes were settled not just by force, but by the interplay of law and magic. Viking legal codes often required oaths sworn on Freyr's ring as much as Odin's spear, blending Vanir fertility symbolism with Aesir notions of honor. A trial might involve both combat and ordeal by boiling cauldron, a clear nod to the mythic cauldron of reconciliation. The Eibigja recounts a land dispute where the plaintiff invoked Njord's tides as witness, while the defendant called upon Thor to strike him down if he lied. The gods' war had taught mortals a vital lesson. True power lay in balancing fury with wisdom, steel with sorcery. By the Viking Age's zenith, this duality defined Norse identity. A chieftain could lead a raid at dawn, then preside over a blot sacrifice for fertile fields at dusk. The same hands that wielded axes in battle might carve Vanir-style protective runes into their doorframes. Even death rituals reflected this. Graves contained spears and sowing tools, as if the afterlife demanded both warrior and farmer. The Aesir-Vanir War wasn't just a story to the Vikings. It was a divine blueprint for living in a world where strife and survival were forever entwined. The clash between the Aesir and Vanir wasn't just myth, it left fingerprints on history. Scholars pore over ancient texts like detectives, tracing the war's echoes in the jagged verses of the Poetic Edda and Snorri Sturluson's polished prose Edda. The differences between these accounts are stark. The older Poetic Edda drips with raw, fragmented fury, its stanzas painting Gullveig's burning as a sacrilege that set the gods aflame. Snorri, writing centuries later in Christianized Iceland, smooths the edges, framing the conflict as a political squabble resolved by diplomacy. Some historians argue Snorri sanitized the tale to fit medieval European sensibilities, downplaying the Vanir's magical prowess to make the Aesir resemble familiar warrior kings. Others claim the discrepancies reveal deeper truths, like how myths mutate across time, absorbing the fears and biases of each era. Artifacts whisper their own secrets. A 9th-century gold bracteate found in Denmark shows a figure often interpreted as Odin, but the serpentine motifs coiled around him hint at Vanir artistry, a fusion that wouldn't exist without the war's forced reconciliation. The Oseberg ship burial, with its ornate carvings of processions and seiðr staffs, blurs the lines further. Was this a Viking noblewoman honoring Freyja, or evidence of pre-Aesir fertility cults lingering beneath Norse conversion? Even place names betray ancient divides. sites like Vanaheimr in Norway and Asgardr in Sweden cluster in distinct regions, as if the gods' territories mirrored mortal tribal boundaries. The most tantalizing clue lies in the saga's silences. Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote of Germanic tribes worshipping twin-brother gods, one tied to war, the other to fertility centuries before the Aesir-Vanir split entered recorded myth. Could this be an early glimpse of the divide, or proof that Snorri and his peers wove older, fragmented beliefs into a cohesive narrative? The debate rages, but one thing's certain: the war wasn't just a story. It was a reflection of real tensions between invaders and indigenous peoples, between farmers and warriors, between the old ways and the new. The artifacts don't just illustrate the myth, they reveal why it endured. Every scratched rune, every hybridized amulet, is a testament to a conflict that reshaped not just the gods' world, but our own. The Aesir-Vanir War has stormed out of ancient mythology and into modern pop culture, but not always with its original grit intact. Marvel Comics might be the most visible reinventor of these myths, turning Thor into a golden-haired superhero and the Vanir into distant relatives barely worth a footnote. The comics streamlined the war into a family spat, Odin and his brothers conquering the lesser Vanir, who quietly fade into the background. Freyja occasionally appears as a warrior-scientist hybrid, her seiðr magic reduced to glowing energy blasts. It's entertaining, sure, but where's the blood-soaked saga of gods who reshaped the cosmos? The MCU doubles down on this simplification, erasing the Vanir entirely and folding Freyja into Frigga, as if two powerful goddesses were one too many for Hollywood's script. Then there's God of War, Ragnarök, which takes the opposite approach, digging deep into the war's scars. The game's version of Freyja isn't just a grieving mother, she's a Vanir War survivor, her people's history etched into every spell she cast. When she speaks of Odin's betrayal, you hear the weight of centuries-old grievances. The game's brilliant twist: it implies the Aesir-Vanir conflict never truly ended, it just evolved. Odin's obsession with masking tape solutions, hostages, treaties, hollow alliances mirrors the original myth's uneasy truce. Even the landscape whispers of the war. Vanaheim's ruins aren't just pretty backdrops, but physical proof of what happens when gods refuse to forget. Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology treats the war with a novelist's flair, painting Gullveig's burning as the moment the gods learned how to hate. His prose lingers on the grotesque, the smell of seared flesh, the way her laughter bubbled up through the pyre's cracks. Yet Gaiman, ever the mythic cartographer, keeps one foot firmly in tradition. His Vanir aren't sanitized, they're terrifyingly alien, their magic less about sparkles and more about unraveling reality's seams. When Freyja teaches Odin's seiðr, it's not a tidy lesson, it's a hungry god forcing himself to swallow knowledge he once scorned. But perhaps the most fascinating modern twist comes from indie games like Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, where the war isn't just history, it's trauma incarnate. Senua's visions twist Vanir and Aesir alike into nightmare figures, their feud a mirror for her own fractured psyche. Here, the war isn't about who won or lost, but how violence echoes through the ages, warping even those who never swung a sword. Critics might argue these adaptations butcher the source material, but that misses the point. Myths survive by being reshaped. Marvel's Thor makes the lore accessible. God of War interrogates its darkest corners, and Gaiman reminds us why these stories chilled spines for centuries. The Aesir-Vanir War endures not despite these changes, but because of them, each retelling adding another layer to Yggdrasil's ever-growing roots. The Aesir-Vanir War wasn't just divine spectacle, it was a crucible of ideas, a mythic battleground where philosophies clashed as violently as swords. At its core, this conflict wrestled with the timeless tension between order and chaos, structure and fluidity, the hammer and the harvest. The Aesir, with their rigid hierarchies and love of conquest, embodied the human desire to control the uncontrollable. The Vanir, flowing with the rhythms of nature, represented surrender to forces greater than any throne. Their war mirrors humanity's own eternal struggle. Do we bend the world to our will, or learn to bend with it? Consider how the myth condemns the toxicity of unchecked pride. Odin's initial refusal to share power, his burning of Gullveig, these weren't just acts of war, but failures of wisdom. The Aesir's dismissal of Vanir magic as unmanly reveals a deeper fear, the terror of being outmatched by something they couldn't dominate through brute force. Their arrogance echoes in other myths, the Greek Titanomachy, where the Olympians overthrow their predecessors only to replicate their tyranny, or the Hindu Devas and Asuras locked in endless cycles of vengeance. These stories whisper a universal warning. Supremacy, once achieved, often becomes its own prison. Yet the war's resolution offers something rare in mythology, not annihilation, but synthesis. Unlike the Titans, banished eternally to Tartarus, or the Asuras, perpetually demonized, the Vanir aren't erased, they're integrated. Their reconciliation presents a radical idea. True strength lies in adaptability. When Odin learns seiðr from Freyja, it's more than a tactical alliance. It's an admission that even gods must evolve. Compare this to the Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, where Marduk butchers Tiamat to forge the world from her corpse, a victory of destruction over dialogue. The Norse chose a harder, wiser path. The cauldron over the carcass, wisdom spat together rather than blood spilled apart. The myth also interrogates the cost of stagnation. The war's middle years gods, dying and resurrecting in an endless loop, mirror societies trapped in cycles of conflict. The Irish Táin Bó Cúailnge shows this brilliantly. Heroes slaughter each other for pages, only for the dead to rise next chapter, their grudges intact. The Aesir-Vanir ceasefire breaks this paralysis through sacrifice, not of lives, but of preconceptions. Odin surrenders his disdain for magic. The Vanir temper their wildness with Aesir discipline. Their peace isn't perfect, hostages are taken, tensions linger, but it's alive, a testament to the messy vitality of compromise. Philosophically, the war's legacy is the third way, the understanding that dualities, war/peace, masculine/feminine, magic/might aren't foes to conquer, but partners to balance. The Vanir's fertility rites didn't weaken Asgard, they made its feasts possible. Odin's runes, once tools of conquest, became instruments of healing when filtered through Vanir perspectives. This mirrors Taoist yin-yang or the Yoruba concept of yu and arrow, opposing forces that sustain rather than suffocate one another. Even the mead of poetry, born from Kvasir's blended essence, symbolizes creation arising from collaboration rather than domination. Perhaps the myth's most subversive lesson is that reconciliation isn't weakness, it's the ultimate strength. The Greek gods never truly reconcile with the Titans. Zeus chains Prometheus eternally for gifting fire to humanity. But the Aesir and Vanir, after centuries of carnage, choose interdependence. Their truce acknowledges a truth we still grapple with. No ideology, no matter how righteous, can monopolize wisdom. The war's end isn't a neat happily ever after. It's a tense, living treaty, as fragile and vital as a seedling cracking through battle-scarred earth, and that's why it endures, not as a tale of who won, but of what was learned. The identity of Gullveig remains one of Norse mythology's most tantalizing enigmas. Was she truly Freyja in disguise, or something far more ancient? The poetic Edda describes her as a seeress draped in gold, her flesh surviving 3 fiery executions, her laughter haunting Asgard's halls long after her ashes cooled. Freyja, too, is cloaked in gold, the glimmering Brisingamen necklace, her falcon feathers shimmering like molten metal. Both wield seiðr with terrifying mastery, both move between worlds as effortlessly as shadows at dusk. Could Gullveig's burning have been Freyja's trial by fire, a calculated gambit to expose Odin's intolerance? Or was she a separate entity entirely, a primordial force of chaos, older than the Vanir themselves, whose persecution ignited the war as a self-fulfilling prophecy? The texts whisper but never confirm, leaving us to wonder, did the Aesir attack a rival or a mirror? Beneath the war's surface simmers a darker theory, that the conflict was never truly about gods at all, but a proxy battle for the cosmos's soul. Consider the timing. The war erupted just as Yggdrasil's roots began to fray, its sap thinning like blood from a wound. The Vanir's magic flowed from the tree's lifeblood, while the Aesir's power came from imposing order upon its chaos. Were they fighting each other, or were they unwitting pawns in Yggdrasil's attempt to rebalance itself? Even the peace treaty hints at this. The mingling of Aesir and Vanir blood in Cave Aesir birthed a being of pure wisdom, as if the universe demanded synthesis to survive. The giants, ever watchful, seemed to sense this truth. Their invasions surged whenever the gods weakened one another, as if they knew the real war wasn't between pantheons, but against entropy itself. And what of Loki's eerie absence? The trickster thrives on discord, yet the sagas barely mention him during the war's centuries of carnage, unless, of course, he was there all along, pulling strings from the shadows. Some runestones depict a hooded figure whispering to both Odin and Freyr, his face half hidden by a smith's apron or a traveler's cloak. Could Loki have posed as Gullveig, stoking the Aesir's fears of Vanir sorcery? Or did he nudge the Vanir toward retaliation, knowing their magic would unravel Asgard's arrogance thread by thread? His fingerprints are all over the war's most pivotal moments: Mimir's beheading, the hostage exchange's collapse, even the final truce, a fragile peace that left both sides too drained to resist Ragnarok's coming storm. Theories spiral like smoke from Gullveig's pyre. Perhaps the war was a ritual in disguise, a sacrificial dance to forge a new pantheon from the old. Maybe the Vanir weren't invaders, but Asgard's original gods, displaced by Odin's kin and fighting to reclaim their birthright. Or consider this: the Aesir and Vanir were never separate at all, but fractured aspects of a single divine consciousness, forced to war until they remembered their shared roots. The Völuspá's cryptic verses feed these speculations, describing the war as the first note in the song that ends the world. Now it's your turn. What echoes of this ancient conflict do you hear in the myths? Was Freyja's golden radiance and Gullveig's fiery resilience too similar to be coincidence? Could the war have been a cosmic reset, or merely gods repeating mortal follies on a grander scale? The comments are your mead hall. Share your theories, and let's unravel this saga together. After all, some wounds never fully heal. They just scab over, waiting for the right hand to pick at them anew. At the end of the storm, the Aesir and Vanir didn't just lay down their weapons, they rewrote the rules of divinity. The war that began with fire and defiance ended not with a victor's crown, but with something far more profound: a pantheon remade. Norse cosmology doesn't speak of separate Aesir and Vanir anymore, only of gods forever changed by the crucible of conflict. Odin, once the unyielding lord of warriors, now carries Vanir magic in his spear hand. Freyja, the mistress of seiðr, walks Asgard's golden halls not as an outsider, but as a pillar of its power. The war's true legacy isn't in the battles fought, but in the impossible synthesis it forged proof that even gods must bend or break. This wasn't just a feud, it was the moment the Norse cosmos learned to breathe. Before the war, the realms were rigid Aesir in their high towers, Vanir in their enchanted groves, each clinging to their own truths. Afterward, the boundaries blurred like ink in rain. Thor's thunder rumbled over Freyr's barley fields. Valkyries carried Freyja's blessings into battle. The world tree itself seemed to sigh in relief, its roots drinking deep from the mingled blood of two pantheons no longer at war, but woven together. Ragnarok's prophecies gained new layers, no longer just doom, but the promise of renewal, a cycle the war had already foreshadowed. So where does that leave us, mere mortals peering into the divine? The Aesir-Vanir conflict isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. Every time we choose between strength and subtlety, between conquest and cultivation, we replay their struggle. The Norse didn't worship these gods in isolation. They honored the tension between them, knowing wisdom lay in the balance. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Does your soul resonate with the Vanir's wild magic, the whisper of growing things, the pulse of unseen forces, or do you stand with the Aesir, where knowledge is won through sacrifice and order is carved with steel? Smash like for the Vanir's untamed mysteries, or subscribe for Odin's hard-won wisdom, and let the debate rage on.